Everyone stinks at it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Move, Crush, Count. This is the podcast where we learn how achievers are changing business growth strategies. We're here to help you grow your business, show you how you can strike back against a world trying to marginalize and commoditize you, how you can differentiate yourself, give you effective tips and advice from top experts that can give you an immediate impact, not only on your personal life, but your professional life. Today's interview is sponsored by J&L Marketing. J&L is a digital and direct marketing agency that delivers results with strategies that help you outsmart competitors so you don't have to outspend them. The title of today's interview is 6 Steps to Change Management Success. My name is Scott Joseph. Today I'm talking with change management expert Esther Weinberg about the main steps every business leader needs to follow in order to succeed at high levels with change management and get the best results. Welcome, Esther.
So great to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Scott.
I am so excited about this topic because, for one, I've went through a difficult stretch when we pivoted to, we started doing our digital marketing pivot in 2011, and I can remember back the difficulties I went through. So I'm going to love to hear all the mistakes I made again, and then what I should have done. But it's not. There's so many things that create change in an organization. And I don't want to jump ahead too much before we intro you, but I mean, when you think about it, you have mergers and acquisitions, and you hear about all the horror stories that happen to a culture when that big of a change comes, right?
Yeah.
We're going into what many believe is going to be a potentially very bad recession.
Yes.
And that's going to create a lot of change and anxiety, but just innovating new products and services. So I cannot wait to talk to you. Let me do a quick intro for you, and then we'll ask some questions about your background and experience as well.
Okay.
So you are a well-known expert when it comes to change management. I mean, you've got clients that include some of the biggest companies, probably the most well-recognized companies today: Netflix, NBC Universal, Microsoft, Warner Brothers, Discovery, CNN, Adobe, Disney, IMAX, Sony. I mean, did I leave any out? I'm sure I left some.
Small companies.
You've graciously consented and agreed to do this interview so you can share with us kind of the roadmap that's caused a lot of business leaders sleepless nights. And you're going to kind of explain to us how to get everybody rowing in the same direction when there is a lot of change that either has to happen or is forced on people, right?
Mhm.
So I want to thank you again for doing this live interview. We're streaming to everyone across Facebook, across YouTube, across LinkedIn. Please comment. We'll post some questions up if you do, or some of your comments, some of your own personal experiences. We do this through StreamYard, and we do not get all the comments depending on what platform you're commenting on. Some show up here, some do not. So if we miss some, we'll get back to you after the show on the actual social channel. So let's jump right in. So can you give us a little bit about your background, your experience, so our business leaders or our audience can relate to, you know, how you can help them and let them know that, yeah, she's the real deal.
Well, it's so funny because I remember when, through the years, especially as an entrepreneur, you relook and refocus your business constantly. I'm sure this is very common that entrepreneurs are probably nodding, yeah, I've done it. And you constantly are trying to think of what's the main theme. And I would say the main theme has always been change. And so
Yeah.
I started my career, just briefly, I started my career in marketing and publicity and worked for agencies. And then I worked for an agency, and then I worked for large brands like Fox and Disney. And then went through a stage when I left Disney, and I summarily left and didn't know where I was going to go. And I didn't know what I was going to do. At the time, I actually thought I was going to start my own PR agency. And then probably 2 weeks into it, I thought I had lost my mind. and I remember at the time I thought, I can't, it's sort of that Einstein quote, that you can't do the same thing over and over again is the definition of insanity. Or the other quote that you can't, what is it? Something like that you're creating with the same mind. So it's another definition of insanity. And so I remember I went to Asia for 5 weeks. And I remember arguing with a monk about change. It was so interesting now when I look back on it, because I was arguing with him. He said, life is impermanent. And I said, well, that's not true. And what are you talking about? We need people, we need things. And he's like, no, everything is always shifting. I was like, what are you talking about? And so anyway, when I got back to the United States, I realized that I wanted to start a business that the foundation of it was navigating and helping individuals, teams, and organizations through change. And so that was the spirit of where the business started. And for the last, a long time, we won't say how many years I've had my business, for a long time, that I
was going to ask that, but now I won't.
I've actually, I'll tell you, I've been in business for over 20 years, and it's crazy when I look back at the numbers, and it's crazy to actually say that. And so I will say, we've been I feel very humbled to say that we've been able to work with some of the biggest brands, both domestically and internationally. We've worked in many different industries. You've read a lot of media companies, tech companies, media and tech. Well, media and tech are kind of the merging of the two in a respect today. They have FOMO. Media companies want to be tech companies want to be media companies, right? And so it's interesting. So I will say that I've also worked in human rights and children's rights, and in Uganda and in the Middle East. And so it's in Africa in general. And so it's been quite a whirlwind, because I've seen change on many different scales, things that have both inside of organizations and also just change in terms of how it's impacted people's lives in general. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I would say that I stand today. It's not only just saying, oh, I have a formula or a framework for how to actually navigate through all this. But I would say that, when you sit with, when you sit with social workers that talk about how children are going through change and how their lives are being, absolutely just destroyed by their current conditions, to organizations that are going through, we were talking about this before, about mergers and acquisitions and how people are either treated with dignity or not treated with dignity. There's, if you go from the small level to the big level, there's so many there's so many things that are congruent with it that it's unbelievable. So I would say so that was been my background in the tumultuous of change. Yeah.
Well, I just think about the 20 years. Let's just take that period. I mean, it's easy to go back and say there's a lot of change over the last 50 to 100 years, but think just for the last 20. You've had a major recession. You've already done that.
Yes.
In 08 to 10, right?
Right.
So you've helped companies navigate that.
Right.
I'm sure you've helped with some of when you start talking about Netflix and Sony and Disney and IMAX and all those companies that you've worked with. Certainly, they've had their share of mergers and acquisitions that they've dealt with. But when you go through something like we did with the pandemic,
Yeah.
um, there's also change that impacts people personally and shifts in just our culture or in terms of society. I just think about the differences today versus say 20 years ago. Even the workforce who we're recruiting now, who we're employing now, um, a lot of people would argue that or say that it's a completely different mindset that I guess the new employee has versus the way it was 20 years ago. That's a change that needs to be get navigated as well. So change is very broad. When we talk about change management, to me, it's very broad. I mean, do you?
Well, I think that we have to eliminate the phrase of change management, because I think what happens is that, and in organizations, we tend to start thinking about this as one-time events, or this happens and this happens. And so we'll have a few best practices in these intervals. But what I have seen so much, if you think about it,
What should we call it?
well, I don't think we need to call it anything. I think
Uh,
it is the way that we're in right now. Because here's the thing that I think you illuminated so interestingly, that even before COVID, 3/4 of organizations struggled to execute strategies. Okay,
yeah,
strategy period. 77% of companies will ill prepared to deal with the anticipated business disruption. And 900 billion, that's with a B, was wasted on failed transformation efforts. That was before the pandemic. So now you move into a pandemic state. And I will say that, if you think about it too, that digitization, our digital age, has also hyper-connected us. It's much harder to predict now how things will actually move. And so the rate of change has increased so exponentially that new threats, new opportunities can seemingly appear overnight. How many people do you know? I can't even tell you this, that there are people that I work with inside of organizations. I'll say, oh, I had a conversation with so-and-so 2 days ago, and then all of a sudden overnight they called me and the strategy has completely changed. I can't keep up. And that's because new threats and opportunities can actually seemingly appear overnight. So we have to have, I think there is a great gentleman named Dr. Andy Zuckery who called it dynamic realignment. I think that has to happen all the time, because you need to realign better than you've ever realigned better before. And I think that the pandemic actually demonstrated that. A pandemic hit in March, many people went remote. Many companies, it's interesting, there were companies that were already remote, but many companies now had to face that, right?
yeah,
And so they all of a sudden had to dynamically shift in ways that they've never actually had to before.
yeah.
So now we're seeing what you're talking about. I think that things that also were more concealed when we talk about the new employee, I don't actually know if it's the new employee. I actually believe it's an evolution of the employee, and some of it was already there. Because I will tell you, in 2019, I remember there was president of the division, and the division itself was all about new products, new technologies. And I remember we were having a conversation at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and he looked terrible, and he sounded terrible. And I remember saying to him, "Are you okay? Is everything all right?" And he's like, "Oh, I was in the hospital last night. I have kidney stones." And I said, "So why are we talking? Why are we talking? You're in the hospital last night. You had kidney stones. You're like out of the hospital last night. You were not kept overnight, but you're still sick and you're recovering." And he said, "Well, I have a dinner at like 6:37 that I have to be at." And I said, "If you have to be at a dinner at 6:37 when you're in the state that you're in, he was going to be hospitalized the night before, then we have a problem." So that kind of dramatic, and it may sound dramatic, but I have to tell you, I was hearing stories like that across the board that affected people's physical and mental well-being. And that was before the pandemic. So
Yeah.
I think the pandemic just revealed to us, I think that also people have come out of the woodwork to say that no more, like stop. Something is really not working anymore. It's just not working
Well,
anymore.
And I think most businesses we're already obviously having a good presence online. We're already moving in that direction, but it's amazing how good humans can be once they're forced to do something versus when they should do something. So, in other words, the pandemic
Mhm.
forced a lot of businesses to reevaluate and said, "Well, if we're going to survive, we have to do it this way," because a lot of businesses people weren't even allowed to come to their showroom, their brick and mortar business,
Sure.
whatever. They had to sell online, right? So there's also change coming in terms of an innovative ideas, strategies, tools, whatever that could be to help make some of those processes come. Yeah. Let's Where do you think, and I'm going to use the word, I know you don't like the phrase.
Okay.
I'm going to use the phrase change management
Sure.
only so we know what the heck we're talking
You
about.
even
But
put it up bold. I love it. Okay.
I do agree
Yeah.
with you. Um, the management part is probably the word you don't like, I'm going to assume.
Well, I'll tell you something. I think that if you break it down, like if we just take it apart for a second, it's interesting. There was data that showed Edelman did a 2022 trust barometer, and they said that it was interesting because they were talking about that 60% of people will choose a place to work based on their beliefs and values, right? They're all saying that if employees trust their employer's commitments, their engagement level can increase by 20%, which you think about that number, it's like, okay, 20% is okay, not so high, but the likelihood they'll leave will go down by 87%. So if you really take what is it foundationally that when people move through change that they want to know that exists is a few things, is three things. They want to know that there's trust, that there's respect, and there's psychological safety. That there is a workplace that is being created with trust, respect, and psychological safety, that it's not just valued, but it's as measured as the bottom line. And that is the main thing, because people want, when they go through change, they want to know that there's road under their feet. That's why communication is one of the most important things in the world in general. And trust is one most important ingredient in effective communication. And it's the foundational principle. Stephen Covey once said it's the foundational principle that holds all relationships. And it's true, because if an employee can't trust what is occurring inside their organization, they'll either be resigned. I mean, they will also resign, and great people will leave, and people that you don't want to leave will leave, and the people you don't want to stay will stay. And so you have
And
to remember
that's
that.
a big challenge, right? That's a big challenge right now.
Absolutely.
Is finding and retaining top employees or teammates. So let me ask you. That's one of the questions I wanted to ask. What are the big challenges when we talk about change management? I mean, what are the big challenges right now?
Well, I think that there's several. One is that, well, you have to remember that since 2020, economic, social, and political pressures have all merged.
Yeah.
So there's a lot. Let's see if we could take it in any order. I mean, there's not an order. So what you're talking about, that there's an impending recession, right?
Yeah.
So there's supply chain issues.
Yeah.
There's talent retention. There's talent retention issues. There's talent acquisition issues, mental well-being, profitability, inflation, workflow, hybrid work, inclusion, team performance, and connection. And those are just some of the mass ongoing and cascading changes that are happening. And so even for fast-growing organizations, it can also feel a bit overwhelming. So those are just some of them. And also there is talk that there will be a resurgence of COVID in the fall. And so you have all these cascading, and plus there's still more M&A, mergers and acquisitions, that are happening as well. So, and companies that we've seen this in the recent year, Disney is a good example. In Florida, when there was a ruling about that when there was a ruling as it related to social issues. We won't get into all of it. And then Disney was positional about it. Employees inside of Disney then had to rally to now start to manage the message as it relates to social issues that they never had to do before. Gay issues, trans issues, LGBTQIA plus issues that they never had to do before. So what you're asking leaders now to step into and manage and lead is enormous. I don't know if we've ever had to ask leaders to manage this level that we're asking people to lead that we are right now.
So let me put on my employer hat.
Yeah.
All right. And then I want to dive into the steps, because you're very good at identifying 6 specific, I don't want to say steps might be a word, strategies is probably a better word, to help people thrive when there is just this immense amount of change going on, right? And some change we create on our own because we think it's the right direction. And then some, like whether it's COVID or some of the things you just mentioned, they just put on us and we got to deal with them.
Absolutely.
And so the employer says, all right, and I'm speaking for a friend.
So I can't wait to hear this. Okay.
The employer would say, looking back, wow, these people are too comfortable. I'm trying to create a new product, a new innovation, a new service. They don't want to change. They're too comfortable with what they've been doing, and they're fighting it. Everyone hates change. All the excuses. Let's walk through the steps, the 6 steps on how a leader that has that mindset, first off, probably failed their team and what they could have done better to thrive through massive change. So if you were to say, what is the first step a business leader needs to take with change management?
Well, first of all, let's just take a step back in the example that you gave, which I love it, which is, first of all, I wonder how that's working for him.
Well, it's working fine now because he got the heck out of the way. But
yeah, I think that's your, but yeah, I have to remember that. Okay, so I'll go into the steps in a second, but the thing that's important to say is exactly what you're talking about, is that once you can being right does not create any kind of movement. It just creates you being in a state of being positional power. So you can have power over people or power with people. And so power over people is not going to create the kind of environment and engagement that's going to have people want to come to work. It's kind of like when I was talking to a senior executive inside of one of the big organizations you mentioned, and they were talking about getting people back to work. And I said, and she's part of the senior executive team, and they're talking about hybrid work, and they want to get people back to work 3 days a week. So Monday, Friday, work from home, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, work in the office. So I said, so what's the spirit of the conversations? What are people saying? She said, oh, we just literally go round and round. It's one of the most painful, difficult things in the world. None of us have an answer. And I said, well, maybe you need to change the question. It's not about getting people inside of an office. It's like getting inside a prison. Like, we're just going to get them inside an office. We're going to lock them in, no windows, and that's going to be the end of it. But what kind of environment do we now want to bring people into that they're excited to come here? They're excited to be here and they want to work. The other thing too that we have to acknowledge is that not everyone is a high performer. And what I mean by that, sometimes there are people that are doing their work, and there may be nothing wrong with that. But we do need people that will do their work plus, right? Because we don't want an organization just with steady. But we also, what I think gets often confused with high performance is we always talk about high performance is we constantly have to promote people. People want bigger jobs. Not everybody wants a bigger job. Sometimes people just want to go to work, they want to kick ass, and they want to go home.
Can I just say, I think that's a common misconception or mistake that a lot of business leaders might make. I think especially entrepreneurs, I feel like they assume, I know I'm guilty of this, or they assume everyone has the same, whether it's passion, motivation, or drive to hit certain levels. And to your point, not everybody, that is not everybody's number one value or motivator, right? It might be I want to have a good solid job that I like and enjoy, and I want to go home to my family, and I mean, everybody's value hierarchy is different. So but I think a lot of business leaders, especially on the entrepreneur side, probably make that probably have that misconception. Do you
Well,
agree? Do you run into that?
well, yeah, and I'll say this too is that look, you always want to have a workforce of people that are constantly thinking ahead. I mean, that's you always want
Right.
them to think about how do we make things better? How do we think ahead? I thought this was genius. An executive vice president said to me, because we're launching an executive think tank in the next few weeks in October, and I was talking to an EVP at a media company. He said something to me that I thought was so brilliant that I have to tell you, I have not heard this in my career. And I'll tell you this too, because I thought it was genius. He said to me, he oversees a mass number of people. And he said, what I noticed is that I'm a father, and I noticed that I want to spend time with my family, my kids. And I said, yeah, that makes sense. And he said, and I noticed that when my kids come home from school, they're most awake, engaged between 3 and 5. And I said, oh, that makes sense. And he said, so here's the situation. I know, and I've never spent time with my family between 3 and 5 because I'm always working. Hmm. He's like, now, look, I know myself. I'm going to work at night. I know my people. They work at night too. And, we're in a hybrid work. And so people have different hours in which they work. Mm-hmm. And he said, so what I said to my team was, what I'd like to do is I want to measure your productivity between 3 and 5. I want to measure between urgent and important. What's the percentage of the work that you're doing between 3 and 5 that's urgent versus important? So he did this for 2 weeks. He had all of his people keep a log, urgent and important. They talked about how to evaluate that. Anyway, they come back after 2 weeks and they realized that, and he said, not only what's urgent and important, but what has to be done in an office and what doesn't have to be done in an office. And they realized that between the hours of 3 and 5, there was 40% of the work that was really, truly that they needed to do at work and maybe was urgent. I think less than 10% was urgent. Right. So he said, so here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to trust you. And I'm going to say, I'm going to ask you to spend between 3 and 5. If there's time that you want to spend with your family, spend it. Spend whatever intervals between that, and I'm going to trust you that you're going to get the work done. Do you know that productivity went through the roof after he did that?
Well, you're also, I mean, when I think about what's important and stuff like that, I mean, there's been studies that show that your most important projects or things that you should work on is probably done or should be done in the morning hours before you've exhausted some brain power all day long trying to work on the most important things between 3 and 5 as well. I mean, I can tell you, me personally, between 3 and 5, a lot of, if I'm not doing a show or something like that, I don't work on big projects between 3 and 5. It's like task stuff. It's
not heavy lifting things. Yeah.
It's not heavy lifting stuff with that. So I do my best work late and I do my best work early.
Well, that's a good point too, because I was going to say that there's so many people that I know that are night owls. And so I agree with you that data shows that also that, can multitask, that if you're actually, there was a book written called The One Thing. And the essence of the book was that one thing will take you 3 to 4 hours to do, that big one thing, right?
Yep.
You know this, I know this, that, if I'm going to sit down and do strategy, I can't do it in 30 minutes. It's insane. So I need space to think. And so, but there are people that are night owls. That's why flexibility with time is really crucial for people, I would say.
Yeah. So, all right. So what would be the second step?
Well, let's go. So
Let's go. Yeah, let's go back to the first step, and then
so
why
let
is
me
that so important?
yeah. So
Go
let
ahead.
me go big picture. So
Yeah.
and I'm going to hone in on what you're talking about. So what we discovered was, in order to really create, because what we found when we looked out, that leaders want to feel ready to powerfully take on all the changes, all the opportunities and challenges that are at their feet. And the question really is how, which is what the real question that you're asking, right? Practical, pragmatic. And so what we found, like I'll go what I said earlier, is creating an environment of trust, respect, and safety was not just valued, because no one would probably argue with that, but it has to be as measured as the bottom line. So we've created these 6 diagnostic areas. We call them zone performance indicators. They're our ways of actually almost creating like a diagnosis to see how are we actually maneuvering and navigating to be most nimble in these kind of times. So we've created 6 zones, we call them, which is what you're alluding to. I'll just say them quickly and then I'll go through each one. So one is action ready, influence ready, connect ready, culture ready, impact ready, and pivot ready. Now, I want to be clear that they're not like you were talking about steps, like what do you do first, second, third? These are not
Right.
actually in sequential order, because
Okay.
as you know, when people move through change, there's different inflection points that people are at, and it's not linear. Like I may be good with the change, and then tomorrow may not be. So
And
it's not necessarily so linear. But
and some people handle change better than others, or have different ways
absolutely,
to, you know.
absolutely. And also, we have to know that the essence of this is we're dealing with human behavior. There's lots of things around it, processes, strategy, of course, but lots of things also around it are also human behavior, which I'll give you an example of in a second. So to explain, action ready is all around. It has a lot to do with what you were talking about with the executive that you mentioned earlier. And what I'll say is this: in the old world of performance, you take actions and they lead to results, right? No one will argue with
Yep.
that. You don't like you don't like the results. Guess what? You change the actions, right?
That's right.
But what we never take issue with is the observer. The observer that we are looks out into the world, that sees that what has us see, what has us take certain actions, what has certain actions visible to us, and certain actions not visible to us. And unless we take issue with the observer that we are, because the observer that we are will take actions that will lead to certain results. And so if we never take issue with the way that the observer and how we're seeing, how are you ever going to have sustainable results? And what I mean by that is, every single person, the observer that we are, sees the world uniquely based on our
Right.
upbringing, our experiences, our value systems. And so, unless we actually take issue with how we're seeing the world, things will never, ever, ever, ever change. And so, the first thing that we do, for example, in Action Ready, is we take apart the observer that we are. Lots of times, how we see, I mean, how often is this the case? We'll just give you something simple. Something happens and I make a meaning out of it. And then I take action based on the meaning of it. But does that action mean that that meaning was true? So here's an
Yeah.
example. You know what I'm talking about?
Well, I love where you're going with this, because, you know, words only have meaning that we give it. And so, it's that's why one word or a phrase or a quote cannot be so upsetting to certain people and not to others. So we give everything our own meaning, how we interpret it. Is that and I love, so I kind of like the direction you're going here. Go ahead.
Yeah, because as humans, we're meaning making machines, and it makes sense. We couldn't survive. Nothing wrong with it. We couldn't survive in the world without it. But here's the distinction: if we don't ever question the meaning, then we don't really have change.
Yeah.
So here's a very simple example. So I was working with a general counsel in a company, and she and her boss, COO of the company, is also a lawyer. Her biggest beef with him is he micromanages because he's a lawyer. It's always in her stuff. And she feels like he doesn't really trust her, and we've had conversations between the three of us about how this dynamic has to change because he has to not be in the weeds anymore. And when something is your subject matter expertise, you always still dip in. So I find this with executives, even as they rise, it's kind of like, if you've had a financial background, if you have a marketing background, you kind of always go back to honing in on that area. So anyway, so he's really tried to step out. She closes a major deal. She emails him and says the deal's closed. And he emails back, congratulations, and says, what were the deal points? So she calls me and she's furious. Furious. So I said, okay, what's the problem? And she said, well, he's all in my stuff again. I said, okay, tell me how he's in your stuff. She goes, look, he emailed me. I closed this massive deal. You'd think he would just be happy, but no, he needs to know the deal points. He needs to know exactly what was in the deal. And, do I have to tell him the 50 deal points that we had to negotiate and how this went? And I said, okay, well, do me a favor. Will you do me a favor? Just read the email to me. So she reads the email to me. The email is a 2-line email. The email said, congratulations. Can you just share a few of the deal points? So I said, okay. I said, well, what did you make it mean? So she made it mean he doesn't trust her. He doesn't respect her. He doesn't think that she's doing a good job, that once again, he's moving backwards in his role. He's diving into his expertise. And on and on and on. So, and as she was talking, I was taking notes, copious notes, because, I wanted to see it. So it was a page and a half full of interpretations. So I said to her, okay, what's the impact if you choose to see it this way? And she's like, look, our relationship will never, and they've been friends for years. Just want to be clear about this. She said, we'll never be friends again. It'll completely destroy our relationship. I'll leave. And I will never trust anything he says again. I said, okay, well, what's your intention for your relationship with him? She said, well, my intention really is that we're seen as partners. I said, okay, well, if you're partners, and she said, oh, and collaborators. I said, okay, you're partners and collaborators. And how would you answer him back now? She starts laughing. And she took a beat and she said, I'll just tell him the 3 deal points or 4 deal points, whatever the amount of deal points were. I said, okay, let's try that. Let's see how that works. So she emails him back. And you know what he writes back?
Great job.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
Emails could be so, everyone talk. You know what? It's great because everyone talks about the tone of emails could be misunderstood, but it's not really the tone. It's like you're saying, right? It's the meaning that we apply to certain things, whether accurately or not.
Yeah, it's very simple. It's kind of like it's not very simple because when you're in it, it's never simple, right?
Right.
But the one thing, in the action ready zone, there's lots of things we teach people. But if we're just going to give people one tool, right, to take away is this. We call it a reality check. That you look at the facts of the situation, the interpretation of the meaning you're making of it. What's the impact if you choose to see it from that way? Now, let's go back to your original intention. And now what will you do? So if you just do that very simple thing, no matter what, it's kind of like, I call it like the back of the napkin exercise. It's it's easy to do. Then what can happen in that moment? Like happened to a client of mine where she was so infuriated she felt like she was being bullied. She was the only woman of color in a room full of white men consistently. Yeah. And one of the guys in the room would consistently, she felt like he was always bullying her, always asking with questions with a tone and always putting her on her heels. And she said to me, and she had a meeting with him, 3 other guys, and the CEO of the company, all men. And she said it was like a scene out of Minority Report. She said they were talking and she said she just saw in the air facts, interpretations, impact, intention. She was like, it was incredible. I didn't even react. I said, it was amazing. She said, it never happened to me before. I was in a room and I didn't get sick, nauseous, and reactive. Yeah. And she said, in fact, when they left, her boss turned to her and said, what happened? You weren't upset. You were balanced. You were calm. Like you were non-reactive. What did you do? Like a secret sauce. What did you do?
Yeah.
So anyway,
You know,
that's
that is so great because, and you know what I love about that is because a lot of times we talk about you have to burn that candle at both ends. And so while there's a lot of things leaders need to do a much better job to build trust, just think about the trust she is building that the leaders now have, because when you're dealing with someone like that, and for the executive to make that comment to her after the meeting, that goes a long way, because as that continues to happen, there's less micromanaging, there's less if both people focus on the things you're teaching, whether it's employees or managers or leaders, gosh, you could just get to the end result so much faster.
it's a
That's
funny
outstanding example.
it's a funny thing because we always say that the zones work on the level of self, team, and organization. Because unless you, like with the example you brought up before, unless you as an executive are examining your own actions, because I even say to executives sometimes when they get very righteous, I say to them, what if you're 1% off?
Yeah.
1% off. Now, if you're, think about it, if you're in combat and you're 1% off, people die. So if you're 1%, now we don't deal in those kind of levels, right?
The same can happen in golf. So, 1% off is not a good result there either. So,
my parents would agree with you. We're big golfers. Yeah, I would agree. But yeah, it's when people get that, when you get into that stage, I'll always say to people, what if it's just 1%? If you can, because people can actually think about that. What's just 1%? And it's like, oh, I can move with that. I can understand that. Then people can get out of their own way. But when it relates to what you and I are talking about, so in Action Ready, we teach a lot about who is the observer and how you're seeing, because that dictates whether or not you can actually move through any kind of change, whether or not your own roadblock, your own obstacle, or your own pavement. Either way.
This is so. Let's go through these 6. So walk us through. Let's walk through these. So make my job easy. I'm not going to ask any questions.
All right, I'll just keep going. So I'll keep going to give examples. So we talked about Action Ready. Influence Ready is all about developing influence through visibility.
All right. So just so we're not talking about steps, we have Action Ready. Now we're talking about being influence ready.
Okay. Yeah. So we're not talking about steps because the thing is, as we talked about before, there's nothing that's so linear. I don't have anything necessarily that's so linear anymore. And change especially is not. And I think that when we were talking about change management in the beginning, that's why I was talking about that we have to really shift the naming of it, because the fluidity, change is happening so fast, that fluidity of it and your rapid preparation of it is even more effective. That's what it's even more effective if we think of it that way. So Influence Ready is all around how you develop influence through visibility. I know many people, especially introverts, will cringe when they hear this, and alignment while building sustainable relationships. And, it's an interesting thing because in Influence Ready, we teach a lot about how do you actually, I would say that influence is the measure of leadership. How you develop influence inside an organization is telling about whether you can get anything done. If you don't have influence, how do you get anything done? Now, here's the thing about influence. You can't be influential unless you're visible. So it's a double-edged sword. You can't be influential without being visible. So as an example, one of the things that we talk to people about is this concept of the visibility quotient. Everyone talks about the emotional quotient, which obviously is very important, your emotional intelligence. I talk about your visibility quotient. How are you measuring and getting your own visibility? And so what we do is we teach people actually to have a vision for your influence. How do you actually have a vision for where you want to be in terms of your visibility, your influence ability in the next year, 2 years, 3 years? What does that actually look like for you? So what we tend to teach people is, one of the very simple things we teach people is, people always say, how do I get influence over people? Like, I don't have a title. I don't have positional power. How do I get influence? The funniest thing is that power lies at many layers and many levels.
Yeah.
And so, and lots of times I've met lots of people have big titles, have very little influence or power. Just because they have a title, it doesn't mean a lot. So it means that at some point they've been good enough to rise up.
In fact, if they don't have the influence and they have the title, that usually hurts a business.
Yes. So, look, I'll give you a simple example. There was an executive that we were working with, and she was working with in a division inside of the company. She was in research, and the business that she served was a digital business. And so they would rapidly iterating business, talk about rapid iteration. Her background, Yahoo, Google, Apple. None of these people in the room came from any of those kind of digital services. None of them. But they're all talking like they have. So every time she gets in the room, they debate, they argue with her, they put her on her heels. And she said to me one day, she's like, look, I'm tired of it. I can't stand this. I get sick in the morning. I don't want to go to work. I'm going to ask, this is a key executive. She's like, I'm gonna ask my boss to switch my area of focus. She's like, I don't know how to manage this group anymore. So we talked about this concept where I said to her, okay, well, tell me where would you want to have greater influence? She said, in this meeting. I have a meeting every week, and all I do is I get arguments about the data. She's like, I don't even know how to defend it anymore.
Can I just stop you real quick? You've given a couple examples of this. And what I love about what you do when you work with these people one-on-one is you don't sit there and try to, I guess, handle everything at one time. You really break it down to a simple thing. Like, all right, you said, read me the email. You deal with these situations, you isolate down, and I guess it goes back to the whole meaning thing that you were talking about. You're really trying to just get to the bottom of that first. And then you talk. I love the way you break that down and help people. You've done that now twice. You've said this, and both times it's caught me and thought, yeah, good. Simple gets done, right? I've got a guy that comments on here, and you are simplifying the problem is not the right way to say it, because no problem is simple, but you're making it I guess it's a simpler way to look at it and really break it down in a way let's back up and look at this. So go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. That just struck me, and I thought I really like the way you approach that.
No, I appreciate that. It's so interesting because you're making me think of another example now with a team. Not to hop around, but I remember this was like a week ago. The executive for this, there's a company, and I'm going to change examples. There's a company that just merged, two massive companies merged together. And so we're doing a team session, and all of a sudden the executive says, new news to the team, the company wants us to be more entrepreneurial. And they're like, oh, the team is like, okay, but where's the vision for the company? We want us to be entrepreneurial, but where's the vision?
That is the vision.
Yeah. Where are we going? Where's the vision? And so they're like, well, when are we going to get the vision? I said, look, I want to tell you something right now. I hate to say this to you. You're not getting it. You're not going to get the vision because they don't know it. They don't know it. They just want to reach IPO status. That's the vision right now. There is no overarching vision that's going to inspire you right now. Right now, we are going to create within this team, are going to create what the vision is. And that is how you're going to move. And what your boss is going to do is your boss is going to socialize that vision with her boss. And she's going to say, does this look good? Great. Now we're moving.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to get the answer. And what I said to the woman that was heading up the organization, I said, we can ask these folks to be entrepreneurial. I said to them, do you know what it means to be an entrepreneur? They looked at me like I had lost my mind. We're asking people to be an entrepreneur. They don't even know what the hell that means.
Well, the fact that what you just said, if there is no vision and you're asking the team to create the vision and it moves up the ladder, I'd argue that is entrepreneurial.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But the other thing too, inside what I find so often today inside of companies is that we use language, but then we never define it. And so we ask people to rise to something to which we've never defined, right? So as an example, I have a different entrepreneurship than you may have, just like I may have a different definition of communication or leadership. So I'd say it's nuts. So I'd say we have to define these things. Otherwise, what I said to the boss afterwards, I said, we have to define it so we can understand the skills that you need to groom these people into in order to be able to rise to the occasion. Otherwise, they're going to be evaluated against something they didn't even know what they're being evaluated against. Talk about the definition of insanity.
I want to get back to your story where you were talking about being more effective in that meeting. And I've got a better way to say it now. When you break it down to that, if I'm someone that's got an issue or a problem and I think, wow, this is really overwhelming. I'm not persuasive, or I'm not having a lot of influence in all these different areas. When you isolate down and say, all right, let's talk about this one meeting. Where do you want to have the most influence? You're making the problem smaller. It's easier to focus on it. I don't view it. I'm just going by the way I'm feeling as you're describing it. And I'm thinking, oh, it relaxes me in a way that, all right, we're not talking about all these things. We're just going to talk about this.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it. I appreciate the way you said it, because getting back to the story, what I said to her is that let's talk about 3 people you want to influence in that meeting. So she identified 3 people. And I said, okay, let's talk about the things that they're passionate about. I call it their passion centers. So personally, professionally. And the great news, we have social media now, so we can gently stalk people. So she writes down, what people are passionate about. And I said, okay, well, where does what I call it circle of alignment? Where do those passions intersect? So she identified one woman in particular where their passions intersected around the area of, developing their people, being passionate about marketing, being passionate about digital platforms. So what I did was I said, okay, well, let's create an environment for you to actually have some conversations with her in a very personal way. So they had coffee, they started talking, and they realized, it's a crazy thing, they realized that they, first of all, had similar backgrounds in history. They're both Asian women, both raised by very strict Asian families. And I think they both were Vietnamese. Their backgrounds were both Vietnamese. And so then they started talking about, she admitted how vulnerable she was feeling about in these meetings. And the other woman said, well, let me help you. What I'm going to do here, and she started giving her different ways that she can be in that meeting. So what happened? So all of a sudden in those meetings, she would ask for her opinion. Hey, Kim, what do you think about this? You and I were talking the other day. You had a really interesting idea about this. So then here's what happens. Spin forward. She's at a conference. Conferences, sometimes you have these, boondoggles. She lives in LA. They went to New York. They were having a dinner at night. And the boss, the head of the president of the division, who told me in an assessment that she should be fired, all of a sudden sits across from her, and they start talking. And guess what? She applies the same techniques, and she finds out he's passionate about travel. He's passionate about Vietnam. And they start telling each other stories about their travel stories. She starts telling stories of how she grew up. Guess what? Next night, another dinner, she just sits down. The next thing she knows, he sits down right next to her.
Yeah.
All of a sudden now, the whole meeting, all of a sudden she's the most valuable player in the meeting.
So what are some of the quickest tips? You just gave one, but like 2 or 3 top tips to help people be more influence ready.
I would say number one is identify one area that you want to be influential. Don't boil the ocean. Second thing is identify the 2 or 3 key people that you want to actually have influence with. Identify what their passion centers are, what they're passionate about. Look at what you're passionate about and look at the center of alignment. Where do those passions intersect? You can develop a relationship with anybody at any time if you have that. Don't make it up. Use social media, use the internet, use Google in order to be able to see where there's possibility for common ground. And then start creating conversations with people based on that, not necessarily based on the work. You can start a conversation. Hey, how are you doing? Hey, I went to a meeting with a woman. I had no idea she was passionate about homelessness.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, for the first 20 minutes, we talked about homeless causes before we got
Yeah.
to work. So everything, it helps you start the conversation and create relatability. Remember, people like to do business with people they like.
And by the way, for any salespeople either listening or watching, this works for that too.
It certainly
It
does.
helps you build rapport much quicker. All right, so let's go into the third
The third one is
thing you need to be ready for.
connect ready. That's about
Okay.
consistency in communication, engaging in tough conversations, taking responsibility for the impact of your conversations. So I don't know if do we have time for all of them, for me to walk through them and give examples for all of them?
If long as you have time, we'll run over, and what
Okay.
we'll do is we'll probably I think we've got some great stuff here. We can take this and divide it into 2 shows. So uh I I think we can let's keep going. This is good stuff.
All right. So Connect Ready, and actually it's really interesting. Connect Ready is all around how do you have consistency, foster consistency in communications, and how do you engage in tough conversations? And I'll give a very simple thing that we teach folks all the time, which is what I call affectionately the 5 A's. What I mean by that is most often that where do you want to make the greatest impact? If you think about it, what's the old adage? Things start as a profit problem, but it's really a people problem. I cannot tell you the amount, the data on engaging in tough conversations is it's staggering. People would rather be sick in bed, sick to their stomach, than actually engage in engaging in a tough conversation that it can actually change their lives.
Let me tell you something. I hate conflict or potential conflict conversations. I can't stand it. And so a lot of reasons, I'm not the best it's not a blind spot because I recognize I'm bad at it. I'm out of the business of managing people. And the reason for it is you can't do that. I think what you're talking about now, that has to be addressed right away. The president of our company, Jamil Zabaneh, with J&L Marketing, does an outstanding job with this, and he does it the right way. Whereas I was always A to Z.
What does that mean?
A to Z means you don't say anything until it's time to you have to say it, and then they don't understand why it's all you're blowing up on people. It's horrible way, and it makes you feel worse too. And what's funny is when you do it, because I don't want to act like that's the way it always happens, but when you do it effectively, that conversation's never, just like anything else you worry about, it's never as bad as it is, and it actually makes you better, the other person better. I like where you're going here. All of this talks about to the culture of a company. We've interviewed so many great business leaders, executives. And even when I do not, because I always want to get at what makes them tick, what makes their company great.
Sure.
And I can't get through a conversation without talking about culture.
Oh yeah, you can't. It's impossible. It's impossible.
And they all attribute their success to the culture of their company. And everything you're talking about here definitely builds a much stronger culture. I mean, that's what it's all about. And so, but go ahead. I just wanted to bring that up because when you said that, I thought, oh, this is good stuff. I have taken workshops and seminars specifically on being direct and candid and how to do it effectively, because I know I'm bad at it. And so go ahead. I love this.
I'll challenge this. Look, it's interesting. When I was talking about the data, it's crazy. Do you know 70% of employees avoid tough conversations? Isn't that crazy? Now, here's what's crazy. U.S. employees, the data shows U.S. employees spend 2.8 hours a week dealing with conflict. It translates into 59 billion in paid hours. Isn't that nuts? So if you think about it, if a CEO is sitting there going, how do I increase profitability? Let's actually start there. Well, it's what I find, the secret I find to engaging in tough conversations is your level of preparation. And most times when I say that to you, when I say preparation, what do you make that mean? I'm curious.
I would take it as I want to identify I would go in if I'm preparing for this conversation.
Yes.
I would want to. I would be going in prepared with some things that I like about whatever they're doing. I would also need to address obviously what I need to see improved.
Right.
And I would have any type of data I could have to help support why I'm saying it.
Excellent. Okay, great. Okay, good. So I'm going to add on. So what I'm talking about is a little bit nuanced to what you're talking about. Okay. Now I'm not saying not to ditch that. Okay.
No.
But I'm going to tell you to do something first before you do that.
Yeah.
So what I have found is if you go back to the context of what we've been talking about, right? Creating a workplace culture of trust, respect, and psychological safety. In a conversation, the only person you can control is you. And so wouldn't you want to make a good bet to clean up your side of the street as well as you possibly can before you get in that conversation? That's what this is about. So the 5 A's, as I affectionately call it, the 5 A's are aware, accurate, acquire, accountability, and action. So aware is, what feelings am I aware of? And I'm asking, and I'm not telling you to answer this now, but I'm asking you to just write them down. What feelings am I aware of? And I would ask you to write till exhaustion, like till you're exhausted, like I can't think of anything anymore, or if I can't think of anything anymore, walk away and come back to it. Second thing is accurate, like we were talking about earlier. What is the truth? Is it accurate or just my personal interpretation? The third is acquire. What learning am I meant to acquire from this situation? Any situation we're in, there's always something to be learned. Fourth is accountability. What is my part in this situation? What responsibility can I take? Goes back to that 1%, even if it's like a 0.5 or 1% that I have responsibility in this. What is it? And then the third is, what proactive action can I take? Now, I find that when you journal this, and if you really do it well, you are able to come into that conversation with a level of neutrality that you never would have had. Because then you can engage in the conversation and understand how the person is receiving it, knowing that they are going to be triggered, most likely, just like you will. But the interesting thing is when you process through, like what I'm talking about, the potentiality for your triggers to show up crazily reduces. Not that you won't be triggered, right? Because you never know what someone will say, but your nimbleness and dexterity to be able to navigate that conversation will be much higher because you're not caught in your feelings or your emotions about it. And you also have a better chance of not taking the conversation personally.
Right.
So if there's someone, let's say you're saying something to someone and they just explode or they cry or whatever it looks like, you can actually be okay because you've processed through what you're feeling, because you've processed through the way that we're talking about it. So that was
there's nothing worse than having those conversations and having a tear form. So because I can tell you, because that's what you don't want. You don't want to. It's almost like it's a horrible analogy, but when you break up with someone, right? You put that, it's right. And I'm not saying we're talking about a termination conversation, but it's the same type of approach where you delay something because you don't want to hurt someone.
Well, that's an interpretation on steroids.
Yeah.
Because you have no idea of what it really means for the other person. You only have an interpretation of what you're making it mean. And that's so right. When does a thought become a belief? The moment we believe it. So if I believe that you won't take the conversation personally, then I'm going to lead with you won't take the conversation personally. If I lead with you're going to be a wreck, then I'm going to think you're going to be a wreck. Now, I don't know in the end of the day which side of the fence you'll be on, but it's a question of the moment I make a thought, we have millions of thoughts a day in our head. The moment I make a thought a belief, I give energy to it, that becomes my truth. Yeah. And we have no idea as human beings if it actually is the truth. We just make it mean that it's the truth.
if it's true to me, it's true,
That's
right? I
right.
mean, so I
That's right.
listen. When we're selling clients or whatever, whatever's true for them is true to them. So
Oh,
perception is reality.
well, that's I think that the essence of what we're talking about. Unless we're taught as leaders how to actually be able to examine the different lenses that we have or the lens to which we're seeing, then we actually can't slip lenses on and off easily.
Yeah.
Think about if you're a photographer. I'm a photographer. I take pictures. I'm a photographer as a hobby. If I see the world through a telephoto lens, and then I give
I
you
only take pictures so I can create funny memes. That's the only reason no.
I like that very much. Well, just think of it. If you constantly view the world through a telephoto lens and then you put on a wide angle lens, you're like, damn, I didn't know the field was here. There's an orchard tree. I get fruit. I didn't know this. And so that's the same thing. I mean, I'm making light of it, but it's the same thing as human beings is how do we as leaders be able to know where our sight is coming from and where we're seeing, so then we can slip on and off different lenses to be more nimble, can choose a different way of being that's more apt for the situation we're in.
Yeah. No, it's good. All right. So we've got action ready, influence ready, connect ready.
Okay, we're up to culture ready. Culture ready is I'm very much a believer in this is, well, obviously, but building an organization based on coaching and mentoring to bring out the best in everybody. So what I mean by that is, can you imagine a culture to where everyone is walking around saying, how can I help you? How can I help you? How can I help you? How can I help build your capacity? How can I help build you? Oh, how can I help give you feedback in a way that raises you up? So, and it's interesting because I remember a client of mine, she at the time was the head of organizational development for Warner Brothers, and she left to be the chief HR officer at a different multinational organization. But when she was at Warner Brothers, she was like, I really want to do this. I really believe in this. We couldn't quite get it off the ground. Then when she left and she was the chief HR officer at a multinational, she said, look, I really believe that how we're going to make a difference inside this organization is building a culture of mentorship and a culture of coaching that is so automatic that we don't even need the program anymore. She's like, I want to get to a state where we both don't need a job. And I laughed. I was like, sign me up. That's great. So that's what we've been doing for this is the third year of our mentorship program, is we're building capacity with the intention to create this culture of mentorship. And it's starting to bleed out inside the org. I mean, it's like, one step at a time.
And isn't it great when you can promote from within, you can have confidence in that? That doesn't come without good coaching, without good mentorship. And think about it. The number one reason most people leave is because they don't see a career path. They don't have a trust that they're going to elevate up or anything like that. So when what you're talking about here, coaching and mentorship, and when it actually produces results and people are elevating and I can just see where that just momentum just builds from a cultural standpoint. And man, after, gosh, I can imagine 3 years into something like that, can you imagine looking back at the differences in the organizations? I mean, that would be just.
It's stunning. It's so interesting. I was talking to a mentor this a few weeks ago, and I think that we also need to do a better job of educating the distinction between coaching and mentoring. So interesting.
Yeah.
He was telling me the story about how he has a mentee of his wanted to be promoted. Normal, right? Everyone wants to be promoted, right? And so they identified early in the mentorship conversation that what he would need to build certain part of his skill level, take certain courses, learn new things, right? Makes sense, right? So then he decided at a certain point, he just decided not to do it. So then he got passed over for the job. He got passed over for the promotion. Yeah. So then they went back and he said, well, look, you didn't do it. And so we got to think about this, because if one of the reasons why you didn't get the job is because your skill level, like, we really need to look at this again. I said to him, I'm like, where's the coaching? I said, he's like, what are you talking about? I am coaching. I said, no, we got to think about this. Remember, The moment we start telling someone something, we're not coaching. So if you think of it as purity, so if you think of it in a conversation, you could be doing many things at the same time. You could be coaching, you could be mentoring, you could be consulting, you could be training. But you have to know the distinction between all of them. Coaching in its purest form is asking questions, get to the depth of the issue, listening to people, and really being able to have some level of empathy. Yeah. Training is when I set the curriculum and you follow me. Right. Consulting is I have the answer and I'm going to give it to you. Mentorship is I've been there. Hey, look at my grand career. Let me share with you the wisdom of where I've come from. All of it can happen in a conversation. You just have to know what you're doing. Because if you never questioned him why he actually didn't decide to take the skills or training that he needed to, how about we start there? Like, what's the block for him?
I love how you break it down.
Yeah. And if he says, I didn't want to, like, okay, well, no, let's really get underneath why, what prevented him from stepping into it. So anyway, he was like, this is incredible. And I said to him, and he's like, I have to tell you, I really want to deploy this throughout my team. I said, okay. He goes, because I have one person, we had a tough conversation the other day, but they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. I said, okay, you had a tough conversation. How do you know that they heard you? He was like, what are you talking about? I said, you left the conversation. How do you know what they heard?
I could promise you from experience, they never hear it the way you think they heard it.
Absolutely. So he's like, well, what do you mean? What are you talking about? I said, okay, when you're done with the conversation, I want you to ask the other person, we've talked about many things. I'd love for you to share with me what are you taking away from this conversation? What was important for you, valuable? What are the next steps you're going to take? So he goes, that's amazing. So he emails me 2 days later and he's like, this is a game changer. This is a game changer. He's like, I've been doing it with everybody and I can absolutely see why we're hitting the mark in some places and why we're not hitting the mark in other places. So simple, game changing.
Yeah. Game changing.
So let's go on to Impact Ready. So Impact Ready is all about growing and developing powerful teams. Now, one of the foundational things we talk about is what I was alluding to earlier in a conversation is that so often I see across the board now, especially from M&As, mergers and acquisitions, and also from organizations that have reorganized, that if you're waiting for someone to tell you strategy, vision, good luck. If I have seen this time and time again, especially since COVID, people are running so fast that kind of contextual conversation doesn't always happen. Plus, when you're leading digital transformation, it's very hard to see the future because things are moving so fast. But you want to be able to give people purpose and ground. So one of the first things that we tell people is, I'll give you a good example of this. There was a global multinational we were working with that was scaling so fast. But what was happening was, first of all, they had no vision. But when I'm talking about a vision, it's not like Nike's like just do it or computer in every home like Microsoft had ages ago. But I'm talking about a narrative, like 3 paragraphs that really describe a picture of where we're headed. And so the founders of the organization, I thought it would take like 4 weeks to finish this. It took like 4 months to finish it. They were so engaged in this process. But what happens when we came out through it, they realized that they never actually had strategy. So everyone was so excited about the narrative. The organization now, people inside the organization said, okay, well, where are the big rocks? Where's the big, bold steps that we're going to take in order to achieve this? Like, we're really excited about this. So what happened was we all agreed that we'd get a group from all across the globe together, like a focus group of 30 people, to come together to create strategy based on the vision narrative. So we created these 5 bold steps, never been done before inside the organization. Then from those 5 bold steps, started creating action plans based on those very tactical plans. Guess what? That year, they had generated more revenue than they had ever generated before in the company's history.
That's awesome.
just by applying a few things. So vision narrative, aligning founder group,
I love that. I'm just thinking about at least all the businesses I'm either associated with or the industries I'm in. And a lot of industries right now struggle with supply, right?
Oh,
Inventory. I
100%.
mean, it's one reason inflation's going through the roof, right? Is because there's not enough product out there for the demand. And that this is multiple verticals. Man, so but think about all the solutions that businesses are trying to come up with to counter or to survive in spite of those things. But they don't all have exactly that's it. They have the idea, the vision, but they don't have they're not impact ready like you just explained. They don't have the tactics and the strategies to actually make it happen in a big way. And so they don't go through the I call them action steps, a step-by-step process to make it a reality.
Well, and I'll give you one other thing that happens that I find this so often. It's uncanny to me, and you could very much relate to this. How many teams are there really inside of a company? Truly, most teams are really groups. They're people that are thrown together and say work, and you make it work, right? But what I find is a couple of things. One is that, like what I said about the team earlier, that we create the vision of, like, let's create the vision narrative for our division. Then, as a leadership team, we need to say, if that's our North Star, what are we committed to? I call it a team commitment. What are we committed to that's aspirational, that's written in future language too, in order to achieve that? Because otherwise, what's our context of being here other than, hey, we're in this division, we're in marketing, we're in finance, we're in sales, we're in digital. That's not context. And so, and guess what? Forgive my language, we're making this shit up because it doesn't exist. So guess what? This team has now created a vision narrative. They're creating a team commitment, and then they're going to create something called an impact guide. That's all the non-sexy stuff, all the agreements, like how do we make decisions? How do we communicate? How often do we want to meet? All that stuff, but we articulate it. And then guess what? We revisit it every 90 days because it is not set in stone.
Right.
But you're really talking about high levels of performance with a team. You just do those three things. You'll find things that you've never found before, the levels of performance you've never found in areas before.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. All right, give us number 6.
All right. Number 6 is pivot ready. Now it's an interesting what is it? Paradox. I know paradox is the right word, but we actually gave change its own zone. So pivot ready is all around how do you master change and cultivate resilience inside your organization. And what I mean by that is, look, lots of times when organizations are going through lots of mass change, we also teach the whole concept of, like, okay, how do you actually consistently move through change all the time? And also, how do you pace your people, your team, your organization? And that's the PACE formula. We have PACE stands for personalization, anticipation, communication, and execution. Those 4 ways is how we actually help organizations process through constant, absolutely ongoing, ever-flowing change, how you do it. And I'll give you one single tiny example, because you said that I'm good at the tiny examples. Okay.
You're great at it.
Well, I'll say
the way you coach these people and just simplify for them, I think, is outstanding.
Well, I appreciate that. Well, I think that, to your point, is that I think that it becomes very big. I think it's very difficult for leaders to navigate, like what you and I were talking about earlier. Everything we're asking them to navigate now. I think that it's almost nearly impossible for us to be asking people to do what we're asking them to do, But what I'll say is that one thing that we do teach in Pivot Ready is this concept of pivot moments. So think of it.
And can I just say something real quick?
Yeah.
I think I want everyone to really pay close attention to this pivot, because if you're going to get through a bad recession, you may not leave your core, but there is some element whether it's a big scale or small scale, a pivot is going to happen. The companies that survive and grow through recessions all pivot in some way, whether it's a different product or a different service,
You have
because they
to.
have to find other revenue streams. That's correct. And so this is going to happen. So pay close attention to this because you want to make sure you do it right. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, remember, no, nothing to apologize for. Because remember, the context of everything we're talking about is how do you create organizations of trust, respect, and psychological safety so that people actually can maneuver change. And I'm not saying you're not going to have your own experience, right? It's going to be great one day, not a great another day, neutral another day. But what I say is this, is we teach people this concept of pivot moments because we can't control change. This, we've been talking about it, right? But
Yep.
what we can control, which people always want to have something they control, is our intentions and our actions. And if you think about it, anyone can shift for a moment and in a moment. And the sum of those small changes lead to massive positive ones. And taking those moment by moment steps is what I call pivot moments. And I really believe it's the doorway to sustainable change. If you think about it, life is nothing but a series of pivot moments. It gives us this kind of a resilience evidence. Because you have to remember, when things start changing, people want proof that it's going to work. And it gives proof that I can change, you can change, we all can, and have the strength to continue. So what pivot moments are made up of is looking at what your current reality is. That comes from, now, current reality, I define a little differently. How you feel about the change or your emotions, how you experience change, and the actions or inactions you're taking, which could support the changes or not. So I'll give you an example. So I was meeting with an executive the other day and who'd gotten very frustrated with her boss, Jamila. Now, Jamila is the president of a division at one of the companies we work with. And she's been increasingly frustrated that Jamila can't make decisions. She vacillates or she can't make a decision. She goes back on it. She also can't handle conflict. And the woman that I'm working with, Aisha, is seen as the number 2 executive in the department and on the team. So what Aisha does, because Aisha is so frustrated because she's managing a large team herself, she steps in and starts making decisions where she shouldn't be. Or she tries to push for more strategic decisions out of sheer frustration, or even tries to manage one of her peers who is also someone who can't make decisions. So you can imagine, for someone who's a high performer, it's like the situation's gotten out of control.
Yeah.
So we talked about it. I said, okay, what's your intention? She's like, look, my intention is I want to be able to manage up with greater ease. I want to be able to be a collaborator with my boss, and I want to step away when I'm frustrated instead of leading and solving everything. So we talked about her emotions. She's like, look, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm disappointed, I'm afraid. And she was also heartbroken, which I'll talk about in a second. But her experience about her boss is she doesn't know how to lead, and her lack of decision-making is going to get them into a sea of trouble. And it did, by the way. She isn't strategic, and she leads with she has a huge ego. But I said, okay, but let's get real. What actions are you actually taking to support your intention of managing up with greater ease, being a collaborator, all good stuff, right? And she's like, look, if I started laughing, she's like, if I'm going to be really honest myself, I'm stepping in to make decisions where I shouldn't. When it was time to present a reorganization plan of our whole division to her boss with her peer, she was trying time and again to get her peer to be strategic because they were supposed to do it together. And instead, what did she do? She stepped in and just did the whole thing herself. Right. And I'm laughing, but it wasn't funny. She was thinking also about leaving, and she was also interviewing. But when we actually use the word pivot in this moment,
nothing like someone who's interviewing and thinking about leaving, coming up with your strategic plan.
I mean, it's what's crazy about it. This is someone who's so invested in the organization. I mean, crazy in the mission of the organization but she's so frustrated with her boss, and she's seeing that no one is doing anything about her boss. Right. It actually took, I would say, well, let me finish the story and then I'll tell you about it after. Yeah. But what I would say is when we actually talk about pivot in this moment, what does it mean for her? So she paused to get real, to see for herself what's feasible. That's what I call possibility, that she could see something for what it is, not what she preferred. So when she got real, she realized she didn't speak candidly with her boss about her frustrations. She was tolerating this behavior to a degree where it was intolerable. Now, by realizing what's really happening, you can also put yourself in the driver's seat of choice. I call it your opportunity. And that opportunity is determined practically and pragmatically and impartially, honestly, we need to stop and start doing to create a new outcome. So that's what she did. When she got real about what her current reality is, remember her emotions, her experience, her actions, when she looked at what's possibility, what it is, not for what she wants, and then she saw the opportunity, now she could say, okay, what do I need to start doing and what do I need to stop doing in order to make the change really stick? Then it was a whole different outcome. Then she could actually work with her boss. And eventually, honestly, what happened with her boss was that her boss got moved out of the division and eventually got fired.
Oh, wow. That worked out well for her.
Well, it took long. It took a long time. It took a long time. And especially when I said she was heartbroken because she went to work for her boss because her boss was an icon in the industry. And so she thought she was going to be mentored and she wasn't.
Right.
But anyway, those are the 6 zones. And
absolutely awesome. You covered so many of them, and I think anybody watching or listening is sitting there, because I like the way you broke it down into the 6 different zones, because we've all experienced or had issues with any one of them, but we probably have never thought of them like that, right? We probably always just thought, change is difficult. No one likes it. I generalize. And so, that's probably, then, I got to tell you, when we first did our pivot, and it wasn't a subtle thing. It was a big pivot.
Yeah.
I guarantee it took 2 years longer than it should have.
All
because without a doubt, it took 2 years longer than it should have. And, I wish I would have talked to you then. That would have made my life a lot easier. But first off, I want to thank you.
my pleasure. It's great.
This was a great, great interview. And I'm confident the audience, they should be able to sit back and hopefully listen or watch this over and over again, because you said a lot here.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, we're going to break this into 2 episodes. A lot of people, they listen or watch while they're on a treadmill or an elliptical machine or something. So, or driving to work. So I want to make sure that we get it in that chunk. But just, gosh, you gave such a very clear understanding of what it takes to get started when you're navigating some of these challenges. But you laid everything out so clearly. I love, like I said, and more importantly, I think when you're working with people, I can see why you're effective, because you have a way of simplifying or narrowing the focus on the issue. Maybe that's the right way to say it. So thank you very much for sharing your expertise, your knowledge. I mean, well done.
Thank
Awesome.
you so much for having me, Scott. I appreciate it.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Ready Zone?
Yeah. So one thing I do want people to take away. So first of all, well, actually 2 things. So if people would like, you can go to thereadyzone.com and you can download my book that actually has a lot of things that we've been talking about today. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, for anyone that's listening, that's an executive vice president inside of their organization, we are launching an executive think tank in the next few weeks. So if you're interested, get in touch with me through thereadyzone.com and we could talk more. But yeah, go on the website. Awesome. It's got lots of resources and people can download the book, which has everything in it that you want to know about change. Well,
all right. Well, thank you very much. And so I want to thank you again, Esther Weinberg, for sharing with us. Thank you to the MCC Nation for joining us for the steps to get started with change management, although we're not using that phrase anymore, and the roadmap that will help you get better results. Make sure you follow and subscribe to the Move Crush Count podcast at movecrushcount.com, as well as you can follow us and subscribe on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. You can join our groups on Facebook and LinkedIn. And a lot of our experts, like Esther, hopefully we're going to invite you, obviously, to join those groups, because sometimes people follow up with questions and you can interact with them directly. Um, to the MCC Nation out there, I want you to do me a huge favor. Please share the episode. We don't spend any money promoting the show. So all of our growth comes organically from people like you who recommend our show or maybe specific episodes to their friends, families, coworkers. So please do so. Today's interview was sponsored by J&L Marketing. J&L is a digital and direct marketing agency that delivers results with strategies that help you outsmart your toughest competitors so you don't have to outspend them. And J&L Marketing is also going to give you something. They're going to give you an online espionage report free right now to the first 7 people. And you got to private message me, whether it's on, I respond to all these things. So you and I met on social, Esther.
Yeah.
So, I respond in my inbox.
Great.
So reach out to me, whether it's on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook Messenger. The first 7 people to do that will give this espionage report. And the question you have to ask, why is that important, is, if you could spy on your toughest competitor, right, and your prospects and even your own company without spending any money or taking up any of your time, how valuable would that be, right? And so to dominate online, it's critical. You have to know which offers and ads are working best against you, which ads are stealing market share from you and where your biggest opportunities are. So the online espionage report does all that for you. It saves you a ton of time, saves you a ton of money. You'll receive insights that deliver the most actionable, tactical, and timely digital marketing tips that you need to move the crowd, crush your competition, and count the money. So make sure you get with me. First 7 people, message me on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook or Messenger, and I'll get you that espionage report right now. I'm Scott Joseph, and thanks for joining us on Move, Crush, Count. Have a great day.